Everyone thought Grace, the mother elephant, had vanished into the Blue Ridge woods. Search teams followed tracks, drones swept over the pine trees, and the herd was moved to safer ground. But Benny, her 2-year-old calf, never looked toward the forest. He stayed beside an old water trough, pressing his trunk against a rusted pipe and calling into the earth. They thought grief had confused him. Then the water began to tremble. And from somewhere deep below, a weak cry answered back. Morning came softly over Blue Ridge Elephant Haven, pale and cold, with fog folded low across the pasture fences. The old apple trees stood still beyond the south barn, their black branches wet from the night air. Benny, a 2-year-old elephant calf with oversized ears and careful eyes, should have been tucked against his mother's side. But Grace's stall was empty. At first, the keepers believed she had stepped out before dawn and wandered toward the lower field. The back gate hung crooked, one hinge bent like it had taken the weight of something enormous. Grass lay crushed near the fence, and a dark slide of mud pointed toward the pine woods. To everyone else, the signs seemed clear. Grace had gone into the trees. Benny did not look at the trees. He stood near the old concrete water trough behind the barn, his small body half hidden in the gray morning. His trunk rested over the rusted rim, and one ear pressed close to the pipe that fed the trough years before the sanctuary was built. He was not crying loudly. He was listening too hard for that. Cole Mercer came through the fog with 2 handlers and a coil of soft guide rope over his shoulder. He was the kind of man who trusted gates, maps, schedules, and tracks in the mud. When he saw Benny standing there alone, his face tightened. A calf without his mother was not just sad. He was fragile, unpredictable, and one bad hour away from danger. "Easy, little man," Cole said, keeping his voice low as he stepped closer. Benny lifted his head, but did not back away. His eyes moved once toward Cole, then dropped again to the trough. He touched the pipe with the tip of his trunk and gave a small, low sound, so quiet it seemed to sink into the concrete instead of rising into the air. From the visitor rail, Mary Collins gripped her husband Frank's sleeve. They had driven down from Ohio for what was supposed to be a peaceful anniversary trip. A morning of coffee, mountain air, and elephants moving slowly through mist. Instead, Mary watched a baby elephant stand beside an empty stall, calling into a pipe as if the whole world had narrowed to that one sound. A young keeper named Riley hurried from the south gate, breath showing white in the cold. "No sign of Grace in the lower field," she said. "But there are marks past the fence. Looks like she pushed through and slid toward the woods." Cole nodded once, already building the search in his head. Vehicles north, drone over the ridge. Get the herd secured before panic spread. Benny heard none of their plans, or if he heard them, they did not matter. He shifted his front feet in the wet dirt and scraped once beside the trough, not wildly, not like a frightened calf digging at nothing. He scraped the same place again, slow and exact. Then he bent his knees slightly, lowered his head, and pressed his cheek against the cold pipe. That was when Clara Bennett stopped walking. She was 67, a retired emergency nurse who had volunteered at the sanctuary 3 mornings a week, mostly feeding, cleaning, and talking gently to animals that did not need her words. She had seen fear before. She had seen shock. What Benny was doing made her chest go still. "Cole," she whispered. "He's not looking for her scent." Cole glanced back, impatient but not unkind. "He's a calf, Clara. His mother's gone, and he's locking onto the last place he felt safe." Clara did not answer at first. Benny gave another low call, then waited. The pause after it was so deliberate that even the handlers stopped moving. For a moment, The whole barnyard seemed to hold its breath with him. A faint tremor passed through the water in the trough. It was so small that Frank thought he had imagined it. A single ring widened across the surface, broke against the concrete, and disappeared. Benny's ears lifted. His whole body changed, as if a hand had touched him from somewhere no one could see. He called again, sharper this time, full of sudden need. Cole moved quickly then, fear cutting through his patience. We need to get him with June and the others. Now! The handlers opened a side gate, and far up the lane, an older female elephant gave a calming rumble from the hill pasture. Benny turned toward the sound of the herd, took one uncertain step, and for one breath it looked as if he might obey. Then something below the trough answered. Not loud, not clear, more like a broken vibration, traveling through old iron, soil, and water. The humans barely caught it, but Benny did. He spun back so fast, his feet slid in the mud. His small trunk curled over the pipe, and he let out a cry that was no longer confusion. It was recognition. No one spoke. The fog moved between the barn posts in thin white sheets. Mary lowered her phone without realizing she had raised it. Clara's hand went to her mouth. Cole stood frozen, with the guide rope slack in his fist, staring at the calf who would not leave. Benny pressed himself against the trough again, trembling, waiting for the sound only he had believed in. By the time the sun broke weakly over the ridge, the search trucks were already turning toward the wrong woods. But Benny stayed beside the old water pipe, his eyes red, his ears open, his little body planted between the empty stall and the earth beneath it. Everyone thought Grace had vanished into the mountains. Benny was beginning to understand she was much closer than that. The morning settled into a colder kind of quiet after the first search trucks rolled out. Their tires left the dark tracks along the gravel lane, heading toward the pine woods where everyone believed Grace had gone. Benny watched them for only a moment. Then his attention drifted back to the old trough, as if the real road did not lead away from the barn, but downward. Cole Mercer stood near the side gate, rubbing one hand across his jaw. He had handled frightened animals before, but Benny's stillness unsettled him more than panic would have. A calf in panic could be guided, blocked, or calmed. A calf that stood with purpose was harder. Benny was not running from them. He was refusing something they had not yet understood. Up on the hill pasture, the rest of the small herd moved in slow, uneasy shapes behind the fence. June, the old female everyone trusted, stood apart from the others. Her ears hung loose, her trunk reaching toward the barn, as if she had already sensed the hole Grace had left behind. When Cole gave the signal, two keepers opened the lane and let her come down. June moved with the patience of age. Her broad feet pressed softly into the wet grass, and her low rumble rolled through the yard like distant thunder, made gentle. Benny lifted his head at once. For the first time since dawn, his small body leaned toward another elephant. His ears softened, and his trunk reached out, trembling, hungry for comfort. For one tender moment, it seemed the plan might work. June touched his cheek with the end of her trunk, then brushed along his shoulder where Grace would have guided him. Benny closed his eyes. He let his head rest briefly against June's leg, and Mary Collins, watching from the rail, whispered, "Oh, thank God," as if relief could be spoken into being. But when June turned toward the hill pasture, Benny did not follow. He opened his eyes, pulled away, and looked back at the trough. The old pipe sat in the mud behind him, dark and ugly. Nothing like a mother. Nothing like a home. Yet Benny stepped between June and the pipe, planting his feet with a strength that made Cole's shoulders drop. June tried again. She gave another soft rumble, deeper this time, the kind that seemed to pass through bone before it reached the ear. Benny answered, but not to her. He lowered his trunk to the pipe and released a small broken call into the metal. Then he waited. His ears opened wide, facing the trough. Not the herd, not the people, not the woods. Clara Bennett moved closer, slow enough not to startle him. Her old nursing instincts were wide awake now, reading what others missed. The pauses, the listening, the way Benny saved his strength for one exact sound. "He's not lost in grief," she said quietly. Cole looked at her, frustration flickering across his face. "Clara, grief can look like anything." "No," she said, her voice softer than his but steadier. "Not like this." Benny scraped the mud beside the trough again, one careful stroke, then another. It was the same place he had touched before, where the rusted pipe disappeared beneath the dirt. He was not trying to escape. He was trying to open a door no one else could see. Riley came back from the barn office carrying a small bucket of sweet feed and apple pieces, Benny's favorite morning treat. She knelt low and tipped the bucket just enough for the smell to reach him. Any other day, he would have stepped toward it with clumsy eagerness. Today, he sniffed once, then turned away. The bucket might as well have been empty. That frightened Cole more than the crying. "He's shutting down," he said. "We can't wait on a feeling." He told the handlers to bring the soft guideline forward. No one wanted to force Benny, but the sanctuary had rules for a reason. A young calf who refused food, water, and herd contact could go downhill fast, especially with his mother gone. When the rope slid gently along Benny's side, he froze. He did not fight at first. He simply became very still, so still that Clara felt her own breath stop. Then the water in the trough trembled again. A faint ring spread across the surface. Benny's ears snapped forward, and the little calf suddenly pushed backward with everything he had. The yard erupted in startled voices. One handler slipped in the mud. June swung her head, not angry, but alarmed. Cole dropped the rope before Benny could tangle himself, and Benny stumbled hard against the trough. For a second, he looked impossibly small, his knees bent, his chest heaving, his eyes fixed on the pipe, as if losing that place would mean losing Grace forever. Mary had started recording again without knowing it. On the screen, Benny looked like a child standing guard over an empty doorway. Frank placed a hand over hers and gently lowered the phone. "Some things don't need a camera," he murmured. Mary nodded, tears gathering, because the scene no longer felt like wildlife. It felt like family. Cole finally raised one hand, signaling everyone to stop. The keepers backed away. June remained near, quiet and watchful, but even she did not press Benny again. The calf lowered his trunk to the pipe and gave one last trembling call. This time, the humans heard nothing, but Benny did, or believed he did, and that belief held him upright. By late morning, the search in the woods had grown louder over the radios, but the barnyard had gone strangely still. Benny stood beside the trough, tired and hungry, yet unbroken. Clara stayed near the fence, watching him with wet eyes and a tightening heart. She did not know where Grace was, but she knew one thing with certainty now. Benny was not ready to leave because he was not alone. By late morning, the fog had lifted just enough to show the first hard edges of the Blue Ridge Hills. Sunlight touched the barn roof, the fence rails, the wet grass beyond the south gate. But Benny did not soften with the morning. He stood beside the old trough as if the cold pipe had become the only familiar thing left in the world. The radios crackled from every direction. Search Team 1 was moving along the pine trail. Search Team 2 had reached the creek bed. A drone buzzed above the ridge, its small shadow crossing the pasture like a nervous bird. Each report pulled the grown-ups farther toward the woods, and each report seemed to leave Benny more alone beside the barn. Cole Mercer kept one eye on the radio and one eye on the calf. He wanted to believe the answer was out there, beyond the broken fence where the mudslide pointed and the branches had snapped. Tracks made sense. A damaged gate made sense. A missing elephant walking into thick timber made sense. Benny, with his ear pressed to an old pipe, did not. Riley brought fresh water in a blue tub, then a bucket of cut apples mixed with sweet feed. Benny smelled it because his body still knew hunger, but grief had wrapped tighter than appetite. He touched one apple slice with the tip of his trunk, then let it fall back into the bucket. His eyes returned to the trough, red-rimmed and stubbornly awake. Dr. Hannah Brooks arrived from the clinic building with her sleeves rolled up and worry hidden behind calm hands. She watched Benny's breathing, the slight tremble in his knees, the way his trunk rested near the pipe even when his body swayed. "He can't keep standing like this," she said quietly. "If he won't eat soon, we'll have to intervene." Clara heard the word and turned at once. Intervene was a careful word, the kind people used when they were afraid of saying force. She stepped closer to Hannah and lowered her voice. "If you sedate him, even lightly, he may stop answering whatever he's hearing." Hannah looked at Benny for a long time. "And if we don't, he may collapse before Grace is found." A sharp voice broke through the radio. "Possible heat signature, northeast of the ridge. Large body, not moving much." Cole straightened as if the words had put steel in his spine. For the first time all morning, the yard had a direction everyone could understand. Men moved. Gates opened. The drone operator called out coordinates from the office porch. Benny reacted before anyone left. He lifted his head and released a cry so sudden and raw that June answered from the hill pasture. It was not the thin call of a lost calf. It was a warning or a plea, or something older than either. He stepped away from the trough, then back to it, torn between the noise of people leaving and the silence below. Mary Collins stood behind the visitor rail with both hands folded under her chin. Frank had stopped speaking. They watched the search team rush toward the very place Benny would not look. Mary whispered, "Why won't anybody stay with him?" Clara heard her, and the words settled painfully because Clara had been thinking the same thing. For nearly an hour, the sanctuary lived in two worlds. In one world, trucks climbed the mountain road, drone footage flickered on a tablet, and Cole's voice grew clipped with urgency. In the other, Benny stood by a rusted pipe and grew weaker by degrees. His ears drooped, his trunk brushed the ground. Still, every few minutes, he called into the metal and waited. Then the radio came alive again, but the hope in it was gone. "False alarm," Riley's voice said. "It's livestock. A neighbor's bull got through the upper fence." No one answered right away. The mistake was ordinary, understandable, even forgivable. But across the barnyard, Benny raised his head slowly, as if he had known all along that the mountain had nothing to tell them. Cole returned with mud on his boots and frustration in his face. He did not look cruel, only tired and afraid of losing 2 elephants in one day. "We searched the heat signal. Nothing. We sweep the creek next." But Benny suddenly scraped the same patch of earth beside the trough, harder this time, until damp soil gathered around his small front feet. That was when Eli Turner came out of the maintenance shed, carrying an old metal probe and a folded map yellowed at the edges. He had been quiet all morning, watching the calf more than the radios. He knelt by the trough, placed one weathered palm on the pipe, and closed his eyes. A faint vibration moved beneath his hand, uneven and alive. Eli did not speak at first. The yard seemed too fragile for words. Benny lowered his trunk beside the old man's hand, breathing in short, tired pulls. Somewhere beneath them, too deep for certainty and too soft for comfort, something answered. Eli opened his eyes and looked toward the forgotten apple orchard east of the barn. "You all searched the woods," he said, "but this pipe runs the other way." Eli Turner's words did not land loudly, but they changed the shape of the morning. Cole stared at the old man, then at the rusted pipe beneath Benny's trunk. The woods still waited beyond the broken fence, full of shadows and unanswered questions. But Benny was not looking there. He stood with his little feet sunk in the wet dirt, breathing toward the metal. Eli unfolded the old map across the hood of a utility cart. The paper was yellowed, soft at the creases, and marked with faded blue lines from a time before elephants had ever walked this land. "This place used to be a dairy farm," he said. "Old drainage tunnels, storm lines, service pipes. Most were sealed years ago, but some of them still run under the orchard." Cole leaned over the map, trying to make sense of the crooked lines. He did not like guesses. He liked clear fences, visible tracks, things a man could point to and say there. But the blue line beneath Eli's finger ran from the barnyard trough toward the eastern apple orchard, away from every search team, away from the mud marks, away from the story they had already chosen. Benny shifted beside them, too young to understand maps, but old enough to understand waiting. His ears lifted every time a radio cracked, then fell when the voices spoke only of woods and ridges. He touched the pipe again with his trunk, gently now, as if afraid that too much force would break whatever thin thread still connected him to the sound below. Dr. Hannah crouched near him and watched his eyes. They were tired, but not empty. That troubled her more than exhaustion. A calf giving up had a certain look, a fading inward, a retreat from the world. Benny was doing the opposite. He was holding himself open to something. Every muscle in his small body seemed tuned to the cold pipe in the mud. Cole ordered the engines off. One by one, the yard gave up its noise. The utility cart stopped humming. The radios went quiet. A truck door closed gently instead of slamming. Even the visitors behind the rail seemed to understand that sound had become sacred here. Fog lifted in pale strips from the ground, while Benny stood at the center of all their doubt. "Give him room," Clara whispered. No one argued. Benny lowered his head until the curve of his cheek touched the trough. He drew in a slow breath, the kind Grace used to answer with a soft rumble against his side. Then he made a call so low it hardly seemed to leave him. It entered the pipe, disappeared, and left the whole yard listening. At first, there was nothing, only the tick of cooling metal and the distant creak of the old barn. Mary Collins pressed both hands to her mouth. Frank looked down at the mud because hope felt too dangerous to watch directly. Cole's jaw tightened. He was already preparing himself to say they had heard only echoes, only grief, only what people wanted to hear. Then the pipe answered. It was not a trumpet. It was not even a clear cry. It came up through iron and earth as a weak, broken vibration, low and uneven, like breath dragged across stone. Benny's entire body lifted toward it, his ears spread wide, his trunk curled, and the sound that came from him next was full of sudden, aching recognition. Clara began to cry before anyone moved. Hannah's face changed in an instant, the clinical calm giving way to something more human and frightened. Cole stood frozen, one hand still on the map. The sound came again, softer now, almost lost. But Benny answered immediately, and this time there was no mistaking the rhythm. Call and reply. baby and mother, distance and thread. "It could be traveling through the line," Eli said, his voice rough. "If she's near one of the old chambers, the sound would carry here." Cole looked toward the eastern orchard, where the apple trees stood twisted and quiet behind a sagging fence. No team had gone there. No one had searched what looked too close, too ordinary, too familiar to be dangerous. Benny suddenly stepped away from the trough. His legs wobbled from hunger and strain, but his direction was clear. He moved past Cole, past Hannah, past the guide rope lying useless in the mud. Not toward the herd, not toward the broken fence, not toward the mountain. He turned east, following the line no eye could see, guided by a voice buried beneath the morning. "Benny, easy," Hannah said, rising quickly. Cole lifted a hand to stop him, then let it fall. Something in the calf's movement silenced the old habit of control. Benny was not wandering. He was leading. June rumbled from the hill pasture, low and concerned. But Benny did not turn back. His whole world had narrowed to the orchard and the cry beneath it. The group followed slowly, afraid to rush him, and afraid not to. Clara walked near Mary and Frank, her eyes fixed on the little calf moving through the wet grass with the seriousness of an old soul. The sanctuary around them seemed different now. The barn, the trough, the rusty pipe, the quiet orchard. All of it had been speaking. Only Benny had listened first. At the edge of the apple trees, Benny stopped. He lowered his trunk to the ground, breathed once, and gave another trembling call. This time, the answer came faintly from somewhere ahead, under roots, under soil, under everything they had missed. Benny closed his eyes for a heartbeat, swaying with exhaustion. Then he opened them and took one more step toward his mother. The apple orchard waited behind a sagging wire fence, quiet and gray under the thinning fog. Its trees were old, their trunks twisted like tired hands, their branches still holding a few dark leaves from last season. Benny stepped through the wet grass with his trunk low, moving slower now, but with a certainty that made the adults follow. Without speaking, every few steps the little calf stopped and pressed his trunk to the ground. He did not search the way people searched, with maps and flashlights and radios. He searched with his whole body. His ears tilted, his feet tested the soil, and his breath moved over roots, mud, and old metal buried somewhere beneath the orchard floor. Cole walked behind him, one hand lifted, warning everyone to keep distance. The orchard had been closed off for years, mostly because the ground stayed too soft after rain. But it had never looked dangerous from the outside. It looked peaceful, almost pretty, the kind of place visitors might photograph in autumn without knowing what lay beneath it. Eli Turner kept glancing between the map and the land ahead. "Pipe should cut under those trees," he said, pointing toward a row of leaning apple trunks. His voice had lost its earlier uncertainty. The old blue line on the paper had become real now, stretching under their feet like a hidden vein. Benny seemed to know it better than any of them. Dr. Hannah stayed near Benny's left side, watching his balance. Hunger and exhaustion had begun to show in him. His steps were less steady, his small shoulders rising and falling too fast. Still, when Clara softly called his name from behind, Benny did not turn. Whatever waited ahead had become stronger than comfort, stronger than fear, stronger than his own tired body. Then Benny stopped at a patch of grass that looked no different from the rest. It was only a shallow dip between two apple trees, covered with wet leaves and pale weeds. Cole almost walked past it, but Benny stretched his trunk toward the ground, inhaled once, and gave a short call that broke in the middle, as if his heart had run out of air. The answer came from below, faint, muffled, and terrible. It did not rise cleanly into the orchard. It seemed trapped under the soil, pressed through dirt and roots before reaching them. Mary Collins gasped from the fence line. Frank caught her elbow. Clara shut her eyes. Dr. Hannah went completely still, because this time there was no pretending it was an echo. Benny lunged toward the sound. Cole grabbed the guideline around his shoulders just in time, not to pull him away hard, but to keep him from stepping onto the sunken patch. "Hold him," Cole warned, his voice suddenly sharp. Eli pushed the metal probe into the ground near the dip. It sank too easily, too deep. Then the soil gave a quiet, ugly crack. A small section of earth collapsed inward. Leaves slid down first, then mud, then a broken piece of old concrete that vanished into darkness beneath the orchard. Everyone stepped back except Benny. He pulled forward, crying now, his trunk reaching for the hole. From below came another weak rumble, strained and uneven, but alive. Grace was down there. For a moment, nobody moved. The truth was too large and too close. All morning, they had sent trucks toward the ridge, drones over the pines, men along the creek bed. But Grace had not disappeared into the mountain. She had fallen beneath the place they passed every day, swallowed by a forgotten hollow only a few hundred yards from her own stall. Hannah dropped to her knees near the edge, careful not to put weight on the broken ground. Her flashlight cut through the dark, catching mud, roots, and the curve of a massive gray shoulder far below. Grace lay half on her side in a narrow chamber, one rear leg pinned beneath a slab of cracked concrete. Her eye opened at the light, dull with pain, but searching. Benny heard her before he saw her. He answered with a cry that made June rumble from the distant pasture. Grace tried to move toward him, and the chamber shifted. Dirt trickled down over her back. Hannah raised one hand fast. "No one touched the edge," she said. "If she fights, this whole pocket could come down on her." Eli pointed to the lower end of the hollow, where old drainage stones showed through the mud. Water had begun to seep in, thin and steady, running along the buried pipe like a cold finger. Cole looked from the rising water to Benny, then to Grace, trapped below. The search was over, but the rescue had become something worse, a race against the ground itself. Benny stood just beyond the safe line, trembling so hard the rope shook against his small body. He could not reach his mother. He could not climb down to her. All he could do was lower his trunk toward the broken earth and call. Beneath him, Grace answered weakly, and for that one fragile moment, the orchard that had swallowed her gave her voice back. The orchard no longer felt like part of the sanctuary. It felt like a place holding its breath. Keepers stretched safety tape between the trees, while Cole marked the soft ground with orange flags. Benny stood just outside the line, his small body shaking from hunger and fear, his trunk reaching toward the broken earth where Grace's weak rumble still trembled below. Dr. Hannah knelt near the edge with a flashlight strapped to her wrist, watching the trapped mother through the narrow opening. Grace's body was wedged at an angle, one rear leg pinned beneath a slab of old concrete and clay. Every breath she took seemed to lift the ground above her. Every movement sent loose dirt whispering down onto her back. "Too much weight on that edge," Eli warned. He had one hand pressed to the soil, feeling the orchard like a living thing. This whole pocket was built around old drainage stone. If it gives, it won't give slowly. Cole looked at the hole, then at Benny, and the math of the moment settled heavy across his face. The first rescue crew from the county arrived with lights, boards, straps, and a man named Captain Ray Dalton. He stepped out of the truck with a hard hat under one arm and the calm face of someone who had seen houses split by sinkholes and cars vanish into soft roads. He took one look at Benny and said, "That calf needs to be moved back." Benny heard the change in the voices before he understood the threat in them. Two handlers approached with a soft barrier panel, speaking gently, moving slow. He let them come close until Grace gave another broken sound from the hollow. Then his ears flew wide, and he pushed forward, not wild, not angry, but desperate in a way that made everyone hesitate. Cole stepped in front of him. "Benny, easy." The calf stared past him, past the men, past the tape and lights, toward the dark opening. For the first time all day, he tried to force his way through. His little shoulder pressed into Cole's hip, trembling with more heart than strength. Cole held him, but his own voice cracked when he said, "I know. I know." They managed to guide Benny back only a few yards. It should have helped. It should have made the rescue safer. Instead, Grace stirred below. Her trapped leg scraped against concrete, and a deep, panicked rumble rolled up through the ground. Dirt broke loose from the side wall. Hannah shouted for everyone to freeze as a curtain of soil fell inches from Grace's face. Benny answered before any human could. He lowered his head and called into the wet grass, a low, trembling sound that moved through the orchard like a thread pulled tight. Beneath the ground, Grace stopped fighting. Her breathing stayed rough, but the wild scraping ceased. Hannah looked up slowly, her face pale in the rescue lights. "She heard him!" Captain Ray did not like it. His eyes moved from the unstable edge to the exhausted calf and back again. "You're telling me the rescue plan depends on a baby elephant staying calm?" No one answered, because the truth sounded impossible. Then Grace shifted again, and Benny gave another low call. Once more, the mother stilled. So the plan changed around him. Boards were laid across the safest ground. Lights were angled away from Grace's eyes. The machinery stayed farther back than Ray wanted. Benny was brought to a protected spot near the exposed pipe, close enough for his voice to travel, far enough that the earth beneath him would hold if the edge failed. Clara stood behind him with a bucket of water he would not drink. Mary and Frank watched from the distant fence, silent now, their faces washed in the cold glow of emergency lamps. June rumbled from the hill pasture, and the sound reached Benny like a reminder that the world was larger than the whole. Still, he did not look away from his mother. The first attempt to lift the concrete failed almost immediately. The strap slipped, metal groaned, and Grace jerked in pain. The ground cracked with a sound like a branch snapping under snow. Benny cried out, high and frightened, then caught himself. He lowered his head again, as if remembering that panic would not save her. His next call came slower, deeper, almost steady. Grace followed it. Her huge body, trembling with pain, seemed to listen to the rhythm of her calf. Hannah saw the change and moved fast, giving instructions in a quiet voice. Ray's crew reset the straps. Eli watched the soil. Cole stayed beside Benny, one hand resting lightly against the calf's shoulder, feeling each breath pass through him like a prayer. Water began to seep faster into the hollow, darkening the mud around Grace's pinned leg. Time tightened around them. Ray called for additional pumps, but they were still minutes away. Hannah looked down at Grace, then back at Benny. "Don't let her stop hearing him," she said. It was not an order to Cole. It was the only hope they had left. Benny's legs trembled so badly he nearly sank to his knees. Cole thought he might finally collapse. But the little calf leaned toward the pipe, eyes half closed, and gave one more call into the ground. Below him, Grace answered, weak but alive. The orchard remained dangerous, the rescue uncertain, the night coming on. Yet for one fragile moment, mother and baby were still holding each other through the earth. Night settled over the orchard, before anyone was ready for it. The rescue lights turned the apple trees into pale, crooked silhouettes, and the soft ground shone with mud. Benny stood near the exposed pipe, his small legs braced wide beneath him. He was only 2 years old, but every tired breath in his body seemed to understand that Grace was still down there, because he had not stopped calling. The pumps arrived with a growl of engines and a rush of boots through wet grass. Captain Ray's crew moved fast, laying hoses, setting boards, clipping straps to the slab that pinned Grace's leg. Cole stayed beside Benny, one hand open near the calf's shoulder, but never gripping him. By then, everyone had learned that Benny could not be controlled. He could only be trusted. Below the broken ground, Grace shifted as the first strap tightened. Her body trembled in the flashlight beam, huge and helpless inside the narrow chamber. Dr. Hannah spoke to her in a low, steady voice, but Grace's eye kept searching upward. Not for the people, not for the lights, for the small shape standing above her, calling through mud, pipe, and darkness. Benny lowered his trunk to the pipe and gave a slow rumble. It was thin from hunger, shaky from fear, yet deeper than the cries he had made that morning. Grace stilled. The strap tightened another inch. The concrete groaned. For a moment, hope moved through the orchard so quietly that Mary Collins reached for Frank's hand without taking her eyes off the calf. Then the strap slipped. Metal snapped against stone, and the slab dropped back with a brutal thud. Grace cried out. The ground jumped beneath everyone's feet. A crack opened near the safety boards, thin at first, then wider, running toward the place where Benny stood. Cole lunged for him, and Captain Ray shouted for the whole crew to pull back. But Benny stumbled, his front feet sliding in the mud. For one sickening second, his body tipped toward the broken edge. Clara screamed his name. Cole caught the soft guideline and threw his weight backward. Benny scrambled, ears flared, eyes wide. His trunk stretched toward the hole, as if falling would be easier than leaving his mother alone below. When Cole pulled him back, Benny fought for the first time. Not in anger, but in terror. His small body twisted against the line, desperate to return to the edge. Beneath them, Grace heard him panic and began to struggle too. Dirt rained down around her shoulders. Hannah's voice sharpened. "Stop moving! Everybody stop moving! She's reacting to him!" The orchard froze. Machines idled. Men held ropes without breathing. Benny stood shaking, his ears wet, his sides heaving so hard Cole could feel each breath through the line. Then the calf did something no one expected. He stopped pulling. He lowered his head, closed his eyes, and made one long, trembling sound that rolled low through the pipe. Grace heard it. Her struggle slowed. The wild fear in her eyes softened just enough for Hannah to see her return to herself. Benny called again, slower this time, as if he were giving his mother a rhythm to follow. "Breathe here. Wait here. Stay with me." The sound was small in the open night, but inside the earth, it became a lifeline. Captain Ray looked at Cole, then at Hannah. His hard expression had changed. "We go on his timing," he said. No one questioned him. The crew reset the straps, slower now, watching Benny between every movement. When Benny rumbled, they lifted. When he paused, they paused. For the first time all night, the rescue followed the calf instead of the clock. The slab rose by inches. Grace's trapped leg appeared, swollen, scraped raw, but finally loosening from the concrete. Hannah worked with careful hands, guiding the torn skin clear. Benny swayed where he stood, almost too tired to remain upright. But whenever Grace's breath quickened, he found another call somewhere inside his exhausted chest, and gave it to her. At last, the concrete cleared her leg. The crew secured a wider rescue sling beneath Grace's body, and the winch began to pull. Mud held her at first, stubborn as grief. Then her shoulder shifted. Her trunk lifted weakly. Benny cried out, not loud, but bright with recognition. And Grace answered with the faintest rumble the orchard had heard all night. When Grace came up from the hollow, she did not rise like a rescued queen. She slid onto the wet grass, trembling, covered in clay. One leg held awkwardly away from her body. The crew backed off. Hannah moved in. Cole released Benny before anyone told him to. The little calf crossed the short distance as if it were the longest road of his life. Benny reached his mother and pressed his forehead against her face. No trumpet, no wild celebration, no perfect ending, just contact. Grace's eye opened, heavy with pain, and her trunk lifted inch by inch until it touched the top of Benny's head. The calf went still beneath that touch, and the entire orchard seemed to soften around them. Dawn was still far away, and Grace could not stand. The rescue had saved her from the earth, but it had not given back the body she had before. Benny stayed against her cheek, breathing the same air, listening to the same tired heartbeat he had refused to stop hearing. For the first time since morning, his call faded into silence because his mother was finally there. Morning came softly, almost carefully, over Blue Ridge Elephant Haven. The orchard that had roared with engines and voices through the night now lay quiet beneath a silver mist. Benny stood beside Grace on the wet grass, his small body leaning into her cheek. He had not slept. His legs trembled, but he stayed there, as if leaving her even for one breath might make the world take her again. Grace was alive, but not whole. Clay dried along her side in pale streaks, and her injured leg had been wrapped in heavy bandages by Dr. Hannah and her team. Each breath moved through her slowly, uneven but steady. Benny watched the rise and fall of her chest with the same focus he had given the old pipe, listening now not for a hidden cry, but for proof. Cole and Captain Ray helped guide the stretcher platform toward the medical barn. The path had been covered with boards, straw, and thick mats so the ground would not shift beneath Grace again. No one rushed. Even the machines seemed quieter in the morning light. Benny followed as close as the handlers allowed, his trunk reaching forward again and again to touch his mother's ear. At the medical barn, fresh straw had been spread deep across the floor. Heat lamps glowed softly from above, turning the cold air golden. Grace was eased inside with slow, careful movements, every strap loosened, as if it were touching something sacred. When she finally settled, she let out a low rumble, weak and worn. But Benny answered instantly from the doorway. Dr. Hannah stepped back and looked at the calf with eyes that had stayed professional all night and finally begun to soften. "He needs rest too," she said. Cole nodded, though neither of them moved him away. Benny stood with his trunk stretched through the wooden rail, brushing Grace's face in tiny repeated touches, like a child counting to make sure someone was still there. Up on the hill, the herd began to gather near the pasture fence. June came first, slow and solemn, her broad ears opening toward the medical barn. Behind her came the others, quiet shapes in the morning mist. They did not trumpet. They did not rush. They simply stood together, watching the barn where Grace lay, as if the whole herd had come to witness what Benny had saved. Benny heard June's rumble and turned. For the first time since Grace vanished, he looked away from his mother without fear. June reached her trunk through the fence gap, and Benny stepped toward her, just enough to touch it. The contact was brief, but it carried more comfort than any words could have. He was not being asked to leave Grace. He was being told he did not have to carry her alone. Mary and Frank Collins returned to the viewing rail later that morning, escorted quietly by Clara. Mary had her phone in her hand, but she did not lift it. The story had become too tender for a screen. She watched Benny move between Grace and the herd, exhausted and muddy, no longer calling in panic. "I thought we were watching a tragedy," she whispered. Frank kept his arm around her shoulders. "Maybe we were," he said softly. "Just not the kind that ends where people think it does." Mary wiped her eyes and looked toward the old orchard, where orange flags still marked the broken ground. All morning, they had believed Grace was lost in the mountains. Now the mountains looked innocent, and the truth had been right beneath their feet. Inside the barn, Grace tried once to lift herself. Her front legs pushed into the straw, and Benny rushed to her side before anyone could stop him. The effort was too much. Grace sank back down with a tired groan, and Benny pressed his forehead against her shoulder, making a soft, steady sound. Not a cry, not a plea, a reminder. "Stay. Rest. I am here." Hannah knelt near Grace and checked the bandage again. "Weeks," she said quietly to Cole. "Maybe months. And even then, we don't know how much strength she'll get back." The words hung in the barn, heavy but honest. Benny did not understand time that way. He only understood that his mother's trunk still moved, that her breath still warmed the straw, that she had answered him. Outside, Eli stood by the old pipe section that had been cut free from the ground near the trough. Rust marked its sides, and mud clung to its broken edge. Cole had planned to haul it away with the rest of the damaged system, but Clara touched the pipe gently and said, "Don't throw all of it out." Cole looked at her, tired and puzzled. "Keep a piece," Clara said. "People should know how she was found." Cole glanced at Benny, who had laid down beside the medical stall with one ear pressed against the wood. The calf was still listening, even now. Only this time he was not searching through darkness. He was listening to his mother breathe on the other side of the wall. By midday, the sanctuary felt changed. The broken orchard was fenced off. The old maps were spread across Cole's office. Crews would inspect every buried line, every forgotten chamber, every place the past had been hiding under safe-looking ground. There would be reports, repairs, and hard questions. But none of that explained what had happened first. What happened first was Benny, a 2-year-old calf who heard a cry beneath the earth when everyone else chased shadows in the woods. A little body that refused food, comfort, and the safety of the herd, because love had given him a direction no map could show. He had not saved Grace by strength. He had saved her by staying. As the sun rose higher over the Blue Ridge Hills, Grace slept beneath warm light, wounded but breathing. Benny finally closed his eyes beside the stall, his trunk resting under the rail where his mother could reach him. They thought the mother elephant was lost, but her baby had heard her cry all along. And because he never stopped listening, Grace was given the rarest gift of all: time. Before you go, tell us what you feel in the simplest way. If you believe Benny was right to stay and listen for his mother, comment 1 below. If you think the rescuers should have taken him away sooner to keep him safe, comment 0. No long explanation needed. Just 1 or 0 is enough. And if this story touched your heart, please subscribe to the channel. We share quiet, pleasureful animal stories about love, loss, hope, and the moments that remind us what truly matters. Thank you for watching, and we hope you'll stay with us for the next story.